Okay, welcome to the second session. This is a natural continuation of the first one because it's going to be an application of textual analysis for hopefully a strong hypothesis merged with hard data, and then you will see the results. So this is joint work with Geneviève and Stéphane Saucier from France, and you will see that the data set is in French. I speak a little bit of French, but I'm not fluent in French. So having co-authors from the language you are using textual analysis helps. That means you guys have a head start to use textual analysis using with Russian. I could not even start with text because I don't understand the basics. But you can do that textual analysis or co-author with somebody that is more fluent or has a strong hypothesis or hard data with the advantage of you knowing the language. Some of you may have heard that now I'm working at Harvard and affiliated also with Berkeley, but before that I was in politics. I was deputy minister of finance in Poland. I had my limo, I had 2 secretaries and 1,000 people working for me. After the summer school, tomorrow evening, on Thursday, I'm meeting with the Prime Minister of Poland. So politics is something that I love. And it has only been a source of testing hypotheses for the agenda that I'm pursuing. And one thing, this is a sentence that I found about an engineer that made Hethetchi. Hethetchi is an incredibly complex engineering work that brings water from the Sierras in California to San Francisco through the mountains and valleys and plains. And the engineer that constructed Hethetchi said that the engineering problems were minor comparing to the political problems in procuring that aqueduct. The story I'm going to tell is somehow how politics affects the weight of contracting. So this is part of a larger agenda that I'm working with Pablo Spiller. He started in 2008 with a very discursive paper. My entry into that project was to formalize a little bit the model. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the model without the math, but what is the basics for the hypothesis we're testing. And then we have a couple of empirical papers where we had to jump into it because otherwise it was like why your story is more appealing than other stories. So we had to use textual analysis just to justify those hypotheses. The first was the model, but without any testing. So it wasn't the other way around that sometimes we have, I have this nice data set, what I can do with it. It was from the hypothesis to the operationalization and the testing of those hypotheses. If we have time, I can tell you a little bit about this other paper that has been already published at the Journal of Empirical Legal Studies, and this one that is under review. This one is the one I'm going to talk about. Is under review at the Journal of Law and Economics. So that you would next year probably it's hopefully will be published. When we think about public procurement, and Paola and Lena can attest to that, many words come to our mind. Public procurement is, public contracts are inefficient, low quality, delays, corruption. This is the typical in Russia. In Russia, public procurement is corrupted. Politics, they are very complex, intricate. Sometimes we have protests, like court protests. But in general, we think of public contracts being rigid. They are not adaptable. And all these categories are negative. So public contracts are bad, and they are bad because they are not adaptable to the situation. What we are trying to explain is why they are less adaptable less flexible, more rigid than private contracts. And here meaning public, I mean public in the European sense, not in the American sense. Public in America is a listed company. Here public would be governmental contract. And a private is between two parties where there is no public jurisdiction. There is no government between them. So when we think of rigidity of public contracts, explanations that were given are, well, because the transaction costs are different and the hazards are different in the public sector and the private sector, and because those hazards are different, we have different rules. Also, the incentives for public authorities are not the same as private. Incomplete public contracts are less verifiable, so we have to attest for several particularities of the sector. But all these ingredients are not addressing why the public sector is different than the private sector in something that is standard. If I'm buying paper, the procurement contract should be the same whether I'm in the public or the private sector, because what I'm procuring is what should drive the contract, not necessarily who is procuring. That is in the standard contract theory. What we are going to explain is why those contracts may be different depending on who is procuring. And the intuition was given by Pablo, but is something that is tautological in some sense, that public contracts are different because they are more subject to public scrutiny. And they are subject to public scrutiny because they are in a political environment. So Pablo in NBR paper in 2008 wrote that a fundamental difference between private and public contracts is that public contracts are in the public sphere. So it's almost tautological. And thus, although politics is normally not necessary to understand private contracting, it becomes fundamental to understanding public contracting. So in public contracting we have politics. In private contracting, the relationship between us two is not going to be affected by the politics outside. Or it's going to affect us both, but it's going to affect all the private contracts. It's not going to affect differently private contracts and public contracts. I mean, politics is going to affect differently public and private, but it's not going to affect differently different private contracts. And the mechanism is through third parties. A third party is somebody who is not in the contract explicitly, but is implicitly. And that third party may be opportunistic, may have an incentive to disrupt that relationship. So there it comes the politics behind. If I ever get the Nobel Prize, this is the picture. So please remember this picture as the topic of today's lecture. Imagine that we have a loving husband and loving wife. In fact, in law, this is a contract. Marriage is a contract between, it's an incomplete long-term contract where you commit for life to be faithful to the other person. Now imagine that contract between a loving husband and loving wife. How that contract is affected when you put the mother-in-law. The mother-in-law is not part of the contract. It's a third party. I'm not saying that this third party is always going to have negative incentives or is going to affect the relationship. But assuming that there is no mother-in-law is too much of an assumption in that contractual relationship. Assuming that there are no third parties in public contracts, that there are no political opponents, that there are no watchdogs, there are no NGOs, there is no public scrutiny, is too much of an assumption. And all our contract theory of procurement is assuming that there is no third parties. It's assuming that the public agent may be more or less corrupted, is assuming that the public agent is more or less informed, but there are no third parties. What we are trying to do in a very simple manner is just highlight that these third parties may have incentives that are not necessarily aligned with the incentives of the two parties. If they are perfectly aligned, then putting the mother-in-law should not affect. But assuming that they are always aligned or there is no mother-in-law is too much of an assumption. So how we deal with it? These third parties may challenge opportunistically. Not all the time, but opportunistically. When they see an opportunity to seize the political capital of the incumbent politician. If I'm the opposition and I may challenge Marina, who is the mayor of Moscow, to take her position, I will do so. I will say she's misusing public funds, even if I don't have hard evidence. Because if she loses, I win. The more she loses political capital, I win. The more she is, I challenge. It's like playing poker, I challenge you. What do you have? In anticipation of that challenge, Marina probably is going to embed some terms in that contract that are going to make that contract blindage. They're going to stealth that contract for challenges. So it's not for the efficiency of the procurement with Natalia. It's just because she wants to avoid this challenge from the outsider, that you are going to embed some clauses that seems to be inefficient, but they are efficient in its class. So these public contracts are efficient once you compare to other public contracts with the same political risk, with the same political contestability. They are not comparable with private contracts because these private contracts do not have political hazards. And Marina is facing political hazards in that procurement. So the testable prediction is, if this is the private sector and this is the public sector, that first, these contracts are going to be different between, for the same item. So if I'm procuring the same item, and the item here is going to be car parks. Car park is arguably very standard. The cars are the same, but it's going to be different if a municipality is procuring or a private sector is procuring. And second, if the channel is political risks, then I should see a difference if the mayor of Moscow is more contestable, the political competition is higher than, let's say, in Vladivostok or Mikhail, maybe. So between these two, there will be also a difference. There will be a difference between private and public, and there will be a difference between the public and public, depending on how risky they are, the jurisdictions. So these are the two strong hypotheses. Remember hypothesis, then we go into textual analysis, and then the results. We are going to, yeah.
Could you please give an example of rigidity?
We're going to in a second, but a rigidity will be a term that makes the contract less adaptable. So you have to deliver on Monday. So imagine, this is my textbook example. If I'm going to buy a car from you, as a private, Marian is going to buy, recall me your name? Basia. I'm going to buy a car from Basia. We can agree that you will deliver on Monday. And then for some reason you are not ready to deliver on Monday, you call me on the phone, say, hey, can I deliver on Wednesday? Say, no problem, let's deliver on Wednesday. Now imagine that I'm a public servant. First of all, I will have to write a very specific terms of that procurement. The car should be black, the car should be at least this size and no more than this size, and it should be delivered on Monday. If you do not deliver on Monday, if you can deliver on Wednesday, I would say, no problem, but please, let's rewrite the contract. Let's do an amendment. So that's a rigidity term. You have to deliver on one day, and if you do not agree, if you cannot cope with those terms, you will have to readapt in a formal way, right? So it's less adaptable. So it's all the terms that are in the contract, and the adaptability is going to be less flexible to external states of the world. Make sense? So we are going to test the public oversight, public versus private, and then political contestability. And public is going to be more rigid, so the more public oversight, public is more than private, So you will have an increase in contractual rigidity, and the political contestability is going to be measured by the political risk, by several measures. I will come back to that. So what is the public, the empirical approach? We are going to test public-private, public in-sample, and also the number of amendments as a subsequent hypothesis. So here, the amendments in the public sector are going to be formalized more frequently than in the private sector. I'm not saying that private contracts are not amended or are not renegotiated. What I'm going to test is whether those amendments in a more frequent more frequently appear in a formalized way. So I observe the ex post, how many times those contracts are amended. In paper.
Any efficiency implications in this paper?
The efficiency implications are, yes, of course, you have a higher price. Less adaptable is a higher price.
Yeah.
Because the contractor will put that into the price. I do not observe the price. So the implications is straightforward. Public contracts are more expensive than private contracts, but it's not an inefficiency. In fact, what she is doing is she's insuring political risks, externalizing to the public at large. So it's insurance that she's buying, but at the expense of the public.
So there's actually a trade-off.
It's a trade-off. It's a trade-off. I do not observe, however, prices. So I will not be able to tell you how much expensive this contract, what is the political insurance price implication?
But usually public contracts are more rigid because you take away discretionality to reduce the risk of corruption.
That is the story. That you signal that you are not corrupt. So that is exactly the story. Marina wants to show that she is not misusing public funds. She's trying to avoid me challenging her. She knows that the contract will be cheaper if she writes just only, I want to buy the nicest car in Moscow for the cheapest price. But if she does so, I come in and say, hey, Marina, you are misusing the money's, the taxpayer money. So she knows ex ante that she doesn't want to be classified as corrupt. So she prepares a very long, very rigid, very strict contract to avoid that challenge. So it's in anticipation. Later on, by the end, I will address also the problem of corruption, why it's a minor problem in this particular setup. Let's go to the setup. One way of dealing with hypotheses and empirical work is think of what would be your ideal ideal experiment or your ideal data set. So we would like to have a sequence of contracting between two parties where one of the party is more or less oversight, and to have some measures of contractual terms. So that would be ideal in a laboratory. I'm not good in laboratory experiments, neither in field experiments, so I go into the real world with that knowledge from political experience that illuminates or suggests hypotheses. The data should be a standard product, because we have to compare apples and apples. If Marina is procuring paper and you are procuring water, these are different items, and they may be, the contractual terms may be guided or driven by the different items that we are procuring. So we want to find something that is common. It should be over time to see these differences and across types of contractees. We should have some measures of contractual rigidity and some measures of political contestability. So what is our data? We use textual analysis just to address those requirements, high bar requirements. We use all contracts signed by one contractor, which is the largest French construction company, Vinci. Am I pronouncing it correctly? It's Vinci. 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 Anytime I present to French, they correct me. How do I pronounce? It's not Vinci. It's Vinci. Vinci. So, which is the largest construction company in France? They have like 40% of the market. Some of the contractees are going to be public authorities, municipalities, and some are going to be private contractees, like shopping malls and the like. The product is very standard, it's very homogeneous, it's parking lots, and a parking lot is just a parking lot, so there is no difference, arguably. One may be cleaned a little bit more, but there are no differences. So we have a data set of 1,300 contracts, including the amendments. We cluster the number of words according to different dictionaries, so we are using the dictionary technique to see different words that would address arbitration, penalties, termination clauses. So we are interested in those particular clauses that would signal terms that are of less adaptability. And we read them all and do different statistics of frequency of appearance. Also, we use the length of contract by number of words to normalize how frequent a word appears. Because if the contract is, let's say, 1 page, and I use one termination clause, it may appear that is very frequent. So we have to, in other words, if I have a very long contract of 300 pages, you will certainly find almost all words possible. But it doesn't mean that is more rigid, because it may appear just in case, because they are putting everything into the word. So we are also normalizing by the length of the contract. These are our dictionaries. So we use different terms that univocally refer to a particular clause. And of course, this is in French. This is the translation of the French words used. So for instance, if I use the word dispute in litigation, it's very uncommon that I will use that word in a negative sense to reject a clause. For instance, it's very unlikely that I will have something like, we will not dispute this contract. So if I use the word dispute, it's probably to signal that this contract is going to be disputed in a certain environment. Okay? So they are not equivocal in that sense. This is the uncontrolled comparison between public and private contracts. Public are more dark, private are more light. So we see that there is something happening, a smoking gun, that there are differences between public and private, where private are using less of these clauses. The way we normalize is using the z-score by the frequency of the total number of words. The z-score, and then we use a y-score where the normalization is to the length of the contract. So one is to the standard deviation, and the other is normalized to the total number of words of that particular contract. And then we construct these measures. We're going also to look into categories specifically and to the aggregate. The measures of contestability of publicness, one is very simple. So public-private, it's hand-coded, whether it's a municipality, the contractee, or it is a private company. So this is the hard data. The other piece of hard data was how contestable are the municipalities. And here we use different measures. A standard measure in political science is the winning margin. So if you win by 10%, you are probably more risky than if you win by 50%. So Putin is, in this setup, would be very low political risk, because he's winning by 40, 50%. But if you're winning by a short margin, it means you are more risky to lose in the next elections. So you may be more prone to use contractual terms that are different than in the private sector. Other measures are the Herfindahl of the political parties. So in France, there are several parties in municipal elections. It's not a bipartisan system. So more lists, more candidates may mean that the constituencies are more dispersed. So that's more challenge on the one hand, but maybe less challenge if the other parties beside the ruling party are atomized. So maybe one and the other. And in France, if I'm correct, there are 2 rounds. So one, if the mayor doesn't win with majority in the first round, there is a second round. We are using the first round of votes. The number of lists is how many candidates there were there. And the distance is how much time to future elections. So if I'm the beginning of my term, my political risks are lower than if I'm closer to elections. Other hard data that were from hand-coded for these contracts, in this particular setup, we hand-coded. The data that I was talking about with SEC contracts was from a large data set. So it's very difficult to hand code 1 million contracts for 100,000 companies. So you have to use some external data set. But in this case, it was 1,300. It's relatively easy to hand code the type of service. So if it's a number of places in the parking lot, if it's on street or underground, so that's different. Maybe, I mean, on street is easier to manage than an underground. The type of contract, so in France there are 3 types of contracts: operating the car park, provision of services, and concessions. And the difference is also in the length of the contract. It's the complexity, but also how lengthy in time these contracts are. The size of the city, the number of voters, the inhabitants, the political color of the mayor, so it's left or right. If it's a renewed contract, year, and departments. In which department? As for a fixed effect. The graphical representation of what we are trying to test is we have one contractor, private contractees, and public municipalities. We're going to compare in the first hypothesis whether this group is different than this group, whether private contracts are different than private. Second one, we're going to compare whether public contracts are different between themselves depending on how political competitive the jurisdiction is. And third, we're going to see whether these guys formalize in amendments more frequently than the private ones. Because if there is something to readjust, we should observe this readjustment in a formal manner in an amendment. It doesn't mean that with Vassy I was not readjusting my private contract, but it was over the phone. With a public municipality, I will not be able to do that over the phone. I will have to do it in paper. So is the hypothesis clear? The technique and the hard data that we are using. Hypothesis, public are different than private. The data, the source data is going to be the contractual terms using dictionaries. And the data set is hand-coded the characteristics of the parking lot and the contractor, what the municipality of the private company. Now let's look at the results. I'm not trying to show you the small numbers, so that is to have John calm that it's not about the estimate, it's about the direction and the significance. The dummy for public in any control with any estimation as significant, positive, and high. Meaning that public contracts have more rigidity clauses than private contracts. In any constellation, with all the possible controls that we have we can put in. Now the story would be how to make it robust to other challenges. So first, if we look into which particular clauses are driving this rigidity, it seems that arbitration and penalty and litigation are the ones that are driving these results. So public contracts have more arbitration, penalties, and litigation clauses than private contracts.
So is the measure the number of words? Like, is it like that private?
It's the number of words standardized in two ways. So in the Z-score is to the standard deviation of that word across all contracts, and the Y-score is to the number of words. So total number of words in the contract. So it's the frequency.
I'm just curious, is it like private contracts are shorter on average than public contracts?
If it would be just only by shortage, then it would be capturing the Y-score that they are more frequent, but they are not. Oh no, in this paper we are not measuring the length. In the previous that I mentioned about the SEC contracts, public contracts are lengthier. Here these contracts are equally lengthy. In fact, I think I have the standard statistics of length. This of means, well, no, this is by the scoring. From the back of my head, I think they are equally lengthier, but if they would be different in length, this would be captured by the Y-score. That one word in a private contract would be very frequent because the contract is shorter, and we are not observing that. Okay? Second thing, public versus private in the Y-score, again, arbitration, penalty, and litigation. So this is addressing the length of the contract. So even if the private contracts are shorter, then one word would be more frequent for the private. But this is not what is happening. Public contracts are, even if they are larger in number of words, they have more words of a particular kind. What about the political contestability? So now we restrict the sample to public contracts, and we ask whether that rigidity, those words, also vary not between private and public, but only in the public side between Mikhail and Marina. So Marina was from very contested municipality in Moscow, and I don't know if that's true, with Vladivostok, which is less contested. So here we should observe that Marina has more terms than Mikhail. And by all measures of our political risk, and we use different measures because they are complementary. Political risks are very hard to capture. So there is no silver bullet to capture how political risky you are. But using different, across the board, by all measures, you are more prone to use hard contractual terms. If your measure of political risk is higher, then it would suggest that political risks are driving this contestability. Answering to Paola, corruption doesn't seem to be significant. The higher corrupted, you have more terms. So the sign seems to work in the right direction. But it is not significant once you put the political variables in. So it's not corruption that is driving your contractual terms. The political variable seems to be more stronger in driving that contractual terms. There are several omitted variables for the presentation issues, but we have all sort of controls, like if the contracts are renewed, which type of contract, if it's a provisional service of a concession, the number of inhabitants, trends, if they are underground or or street level. And experience and past contracts. All these variables are not significant. So the political variables are driving the contractual terms. As a placebo, we now make the same comparison, the same variables, for the private sector. If my story is true, if my story wouldn't have been true, then I should observe some political correlation in the terms, the more contested you are, because private contracts would also be affected by the political environment. But it doesn't seem to be affected the same way that the public are. So that is like a placebo test that these contracts are really different than these ones in terms of political risks. What about the renegotiations? This is a proposition that is not related directly to the model, but is an implication to the first paper, the theoretical model. And the implication is the following. If I am a public authority, I will probably renegotiate the contract. A contract that is more rigid is going to be renegotiated more often. That's true. But here is how many times I see that renegotiation formalized in an amendment. I see the ex post, only how many times is in a paper. So one thing is more rigid contracts are going to be renegotiated more often, but they're also going to be in paper more, that in the renegotiation formalized. And we only observe the ex post. And what we observe is that public contracts are renegotiated like 10% more often than private contracts. Again, I should rephrase it. It's not 10% more renegotiations, it's 10% more formal renegotiations in a paper. Maybe that the terms in the private sector are renegotiated over the phone very often, but we don't observe how many times. What we observe is when the public sector renegotiates, that renegotiation is written down in a paper. Robustness checks, we introduce contract duration, also different level of clustering and fixed effects. The results are not substantially changed by any type of control. Corruption, and here we address the question of Paola. First, the story is about signaling that I'm honest. So more corruption could also drive my rigidity into the right direction, because more rigidity would be that I should observe more corruption, more rigid terms. So that would be my story. The counter story would be that more corruption, I'm using discretionary terms. But this is not what we observe. First, corruption is not significant. The measures of corruption that we have is the perception. So again, this is a very tricky measure of corruption. It's not real corruption, it's how it's perceived. But it's the only measure that we have. At a departmental level. This is not municipal level, it's the departmental level. Second, we see signed contracts, not the bidding terms. So if I want to favorize a private contractor, why I would make him easier the bidding process, or more hard the bidding process to select a narrow term. But once I'm contracting, why should I narrow and make his life harder? I'm not saying the bidding process. It's just a contract. Once he won, and I like very much Eugenia, and she won the contract, why I would make her life harder with harder contractual terms? If I'm corrupt, if we are favorizing each other, or she's paying me sidekicks. So I would rather, the estimate would work on the other side. Third, we have a single contractor here, which is the largest company in France. If I'm in a small city, are you from Marseille?
No.
But Toulouse. So imagine that I'm dishonest as the mayor of Toulouse and asking her to give me kickbacks in Toulouse, but not somewhere else. The spillovers for this company are so big that because of one case, they may be losing much more. So it doesn't seem that corruption, unless it's overspread and all colluded and everybody keeps its mouth shut, is going to be an issue. Because of this being the largest company, and it has too much to lose. And last one, by French law, companies cannot give donations to corporations. Corporations cannot give money to politicians. So it's not a story like in the US. You have super PACs and Citizens United, where corporations can pay for politicians. If they would do so, it's a clear case of corruption, so we fall into point 3, where the spillovers would be much negative for the company. Limitations, we're using a very simple technique of textual analysis, which is counting words using dictionaries. So this is not sophisticated. It's a very rudimentary approach. Corruption is a confounding factor. We're using perception indices, and we can only tell in a discursive way that is not an issue, but we do not have a hard measure of corruption. And there may be some omitted variables as demand stochasticity, which may be captured somehow by geographical and year fixed effects. But still, I don't see the differences in demand for car parks in Toulouse versus Paris. Maybe that Toulouse is very stable and Paris is very stochastic, and I do not see that difference in the demand for parking spaces. And we do not see the prices, how much they were charged. Also because some of these contracts are very long and they are readapted. Concluding remarks. So we see the hypothesis was public contracts are more rigid than private contracts, and we find evidence of that. Public contracts are more rigid the more politically competitive the jurisdiction is. There is evidence also of that issue, which does not happen in the private sector. And third, that these contracts are renegotiated in a more formal manner. So we find that ex post, there are more amendments made to public contracts than to private contracts. Let me, the methodology itself is replicable, so we can analyze using these same dictionaries other contracts. So a way of testing it or to falsify this methodology would be, for instance, using my dictionaries with Russian contracts. And if you find the inverse evidence, then I'm wrong. But the idea that a theory should be falsifiable makes it a theory. So if I say that there is life in Alpha Centauri, that is falsifiable, but it's not doable right now. So I cannot test for it. If I say something that is not even falsifiable, that may be a true statement, but it's not falsifiable, then it's not a theory. That I'm happier than you are. So, well, how can you falsify that? That I'm happier than you. It could be a statement, it could be true, but it's not falsifiable. You cannot make evidence that make my case wrong. But this is falsifiable. So it makes it a theory in that sense. And we give a plausible rationale why public contracts seem to be inefficient, but they are efficient in its class. Because we have a little bit of time, I have like 10 minutes. Let me briefly talk to you about two projects that are also under this agenda. This paper was recently accepted at the Journal of Empirical Legal Studies, which is a journal I would suggest to you if you are doing empirical work using anything close to legal terms. Sometimes you see a difference in the law and say, well, who would be interested in accepting this paper? There is no strong economic theory behind, but there is some interesting law insight. So for law and economics guys, this could be an interesting outlet, and it's a good journal. So what we did here is we downloaded 1 million contracts from the Stock and Exchange Commission. These contracts were translated into text because some of them are PDF, some of them are HTML, so you have to convert to something that is similar one to another. Then we identify the company by the company identification key. And once you have the company identification key, you have the financials of that company and all the characteristics like location and sector and profit and sales, all the financials, year by year. And we classify the companies. We don't have here public-private, but the closest to public was utilities. So utilities are arguably closer to the public sector than for motor company. The hypothesis was that public contracts are lengthier, so lengthier in number of words, and also have more frequent terms, rigidity terms, than private contracts. Of course, this could be driven by the sector, but that was exactly what we were testing, that the sectors are different because one is subject to more public scrutiny. And what we find is that utilities have more arbitration, certification, evaluation, litigation penalties than the comparable private contracts. Comparable by asset size, and another group controlling was quasi-utilities. Quasi-regulated, not quasi-utilities, quasi-regulated industries. And by default, the zeros here are the private contracts. So the comparison is utilities have 36% more arbitration terms than a comparable private contract in length. Another project is using the same idea of political contestability and rigidity. In the US, my point is to show you different setups where you can test a theory and you have to come with an inventive way, creative way of getting the measure of rigidity. In the US, municipalities use bonds for financing. So you can get a loan, but in general, they go to the bond market. The bond market is very liquid. And there are different types of bond that can be roughly classified into two categories: general obligation bond and revenue bonds. A general obligation bond is the bond that you may probably have intuitively in mind. You borrow money and you spend wherever you want and you pay back with the sources of revenue of the municipality. So the general obligation bond pledges to all sources of financing of the municipality. A revenue bond, on the other hand, is a bond where you borrow money for a particular project, let's say utilities, water utilities, this water utility, and you have to pay back with earmarked money. For instance, the fees collected from the utility. Okay? So you have to have a specific project and earmarked money. In contractual terms, this would seem that somebody on a bike, electric. In contractual terms, the general obligation bond is a very flexible form of contracting, of financing. Because give me your monies, I will use for whatever I want, and I will pay you back with whatever I want. A revenue bond, on the other hand, is a very rigid form of contracting. I can only use in this for this project, and I have to pay you back from these particular sources. Moreover, a general obligation bond is subject to a referendum. So you can only issue a general obligation bond if you go through a referendum and you are positive, with a supermajority of 60 or 2/3. In California, it was lowered to 55%, but still higher than 50%. Therefore, a general obligation bond is more subject to scrutiny, because you have to, you're going to be scrutinized twice. If you want to avoid scrutiny, you're going to choose a more rigid form of contracting, of municipal bond, which by the other hand is more expensive. The interest rate is higher. So the test was, do we see more revenue bonds in more competitive jurisdictions, municipalities? Because if I'm a mayor of a municipality that is more contestable, is at a higher political risk, I don't want to go through a referendum and lose the referendum. And maybe I would choose a more rigid form, although it's more expensive, but it's going to be paid by the citizens. And we have anecdotal evidence of this being in the press. So the press tells you the story that a municipality is building something using revenue bonds because they want to avoid going to a referendum. And we find, indeed, that by several measures of political competition, so the margin quintile is, the first quintile is very competitive, the second quintile is less competitive, fifth is the lowest competitive. So the estimate is in the right direction. The lower you are, the more rigid you use. Large margin is a dummy variable to show if you are more than 20% in margin. So if I'm more than 20% in margin, I will use a less rigid term than if I'm in the lower 20% of margin. And partisan swings is how many times you swing the party in the last elections. So if there's always one party, it's not competitive. If you swing more, it's more competitive, so you should see more revenue bonds, more a positive sign. So if you change one quintile, you're going to use revenue bonds 2% less than if you are in an upper quintile. The same with margin. If I'm in 20% margin and 30%, if I'm 30%, I'm going to use 5% less revenue bonds than if I'm in a 5% margin. And partisan swings matters a lot. So if I change all the time parties, I'm going to use 10% more revenue bonds. And also, interestingly, the closer you are to the next elections, you are going to use also more revenue bonds. This could be driven because also you are more indebted and you cannot use general obligation bonds, but it could be also the story that closer to elections I'm more sensitive to the political risks. Because now, at the beginning of my term, everybody forgets what happened, but what happens in the last year is more salient to the choice. As I mentioned in the previous presentation, there are tons of work that can be done with textual analysis. This is only an ancillary technique. Is not the most important presentation that you will have, but it's important for you to know that there is such a methodology, such a tool that can be helpful to build up on other data sets and to support your hypothesis. And because it's still very fashion, as the Bayesian, what was the topic that now it's called at AR?
Bayesian persuasion.
Bayesian persuasion. Textual analysis, at least in law and economics, is now very cool. If you do something in this area, it's still publishable. I'm not guaranteeing that in 10 years it's going to be so. So it's better to hit the iron when it's still hot. So we can I'm not exaggerating if I say that we can translate almost everything into text. Almost any text that is scanned or PDF into text. There are very good software to translate into text. Anecdotally, I can add that at Harvard there is a startup from California called Rebel Law that they are digitizing all case law in the United States. This is about 40 million cases, 40,000 volumes, and I have seen this machine working. So there is a guy that opens the book, the case with cases, cuts the pages, so you have all single pages, puts it in a scanning machine that is from here to the wall, and this machine scans about 700 pages per minute, both-sided, with a precision of 99.97% accuracy. That means the machine knows if a number is a footnote or is the page number, and the footnote is rightly identified. Moreover, if there is a spelling mistake, it's most likely that is a spelling mistake in the original case than it is a spelling mistake in capturing that mistake by the OCR. So they're very accurate. It doesn't mean that the software that we have for free would be that accurate. But we don't need an accuracy of 99.97%. We are not physicians that we need to have medicines extremely accurate. We just need an accuracy of 1%. Statistical significance is enough for us. I cannot also strengthen enough the need to have some hard data to cope, to merge with the textual. Don't do just textual analysis for the textual analysis. You remember what I showed about constitutions. So this guy made a huge topic analysis of constitutions, but without any hypothesis behind, well, with a very soft hypothesis, and without any other hard data. So he was just proving that there are 3 types of constitutions. And so what? Fine, I could come to the same conclusion reading the constitutions by myself, because there are 200 constitutions around the world, and I can very simply just gather randomly 10 of them and say, well, we see these patterns. We don't need a very sophisticated textual analysis procedure to come up to the same conclusion. This procedure should be used when you have hundreds, thousands of documents that you cannot process yourself. So you would like to be them to be processed in a more automatic fashion to narrow down what you're looking for. But then when you're looking for, just merge with some hard data so that you use the textual and the textual variables as your independent variable, one of your independent variables, or your dependent variable, but together with other ones, not just only in that sum. So now we have a couple of minutes. If you have ideas, we can continue with this paper. So I'm very interested in projects that deal with public-private choices, discretionary choices, and political variables. So if you have ideas of how to address discretionary choices by public agents and private agents, or public agents alone, together with political data, that is of great interest. For instance, in Russia, you have different regions. That is one of the perfect candidates. And you have different procurement procedures. That is also a discretionary choice you make. So are these choices just random by the public agents, or they are chosen because of a particular environment? Just correlating these two things seems to be of very illustrative and descriptive. Yes?
Comment, among your variable, you have penalties. And so you know that you can design a contract which is equivalent with penalties or bonus. Just
with penalties or?
Bonus.
Bonds.
Yes. So,
a bonus.
yes. I'm asking if not including the bonuses which could make an equivalent contract, you lose something in terms of...
Absolutely, maybe that's true. So here what I would rephrase your question into this one. What you are saying is, Marian, your dictionaries are not complete. Fine. If you now come up with a better dictionary, this is how we build science. This is how we build science. I mean, we are social scientists, but this is how we build. Say, hey, this is not complete. I just add one category or one word, or I take something out, and your results are better or fall apart. Fine.
Now the point is that
maybe I'm overlooking that penalties is not complete. I should have a category here like bonuses. Fine. I didn't realize that before. It was not on purpose that I omitted that. But running the same thing with bonuses may make the results stronger, or they may fall apart. In either case, you are in, yeah.
because for what I know, bonuses are more used in private construction, so this could be a different. Moreover, in some countries, like in Italy, you cannot use bonuses in public contracts, just penalties. So I don't know if it is the same in France. If it
Yes.
is the same in France, my point is that,
But even if that's true what you're saying, and I have no evidence, but assuming that you are right, a bonus is a discretionary measure, and it will be more subject to a challenge of misusing of public funds because I'm giving you more money. And that's why in the public sector you see more penalties instead of bonuses. So if I add that variable, probably is going to strengthen the results because I would see a negative on the bonuses and a higher on the penalties. Correct?
I think so.
But this is again, you can fine-tune dictionaries. You can create your own dictionaries. This was built on a paper by Schwartz and Watson. Schwartz is a very known professor from Yale. And they started with these words. And then we developed a series of other ones. Now you can construct your own for your own purposes. There are other dictionaries, for instance, to set ethical standards. So if you are more on the you shall do something or you shall not do.
I have an idea they would hate in the Journal of Empirical Legal Studies. The hypothesis is lawyers create rigidities. What you do is you check contracts and look for rigidities. You link to a data set of how many lawyers are employed by both parties of the contract. And the expected result is more lawyers give you more rigidities.
Okay. If you
That would be pretty controversial.
yes, but that is
The welfare cost of too much lawyers.
yeah. What you are saying is there is a collusion among the profession on both sides because we give money to both sides.
I've been trying to make a contract.
Yes. Well,
with a bank.
let me anecdotically also tell you that there are some very highly sophisticated startups now working on textual analysis for standard contracts that would yield the law profession just for a very tiny fraction of people. The Ravel law startup that I was mentioning, that they are digitizing all case laws, well, they have already done with California. And it's amazing what these guys are doing. So now, looking for cases that relate to one case is one slide. You put a case and they show you graphically all the linkages among time for the 75 more relevant cases. And you can expand to 170. Second, you can look for, you know that I know Elena is going to be my judge in that case. I can look for all her cases in the past years on that topic. And guess what? It shows that judges copy-paste themselves in their opinions. So if I'm a lawyer, I know how to prepare better my case with Elena because she's consistent. A long time. She's copy-pasting herself. So now in the future, instead of having 100 lawyers, I only need one research assistant and one lawyer to make my case. So this goes either way. Law is getting more complicated, but we have amazing tools now to boil it down just to one guy with one computer and one software to narrow which cases are relevant, how to address that lawyer, and moreover, there are also guys working on preparing the case on one button. So you have like the items, then you have to fine-tune, but preparing a standard contract and preparing your case is going to be almost automatic. And I'm just on time. We can go to the coffee break and continue the discussion. Thank you.